The $7 million Ferrari loft Ferrari Aperta had been sitting untouched for 3 weeks, not on display, but because no one could fix it. Giselle Voss hired 6 world-class specialists, flew in engineers from Italy, and received 6 reports that said the same thing. No fault found. She told the press that no ordinary garage had the expertise to touch her asset. But that Friday afternoon, Caleb Reed, owner of a modest repair shop on Cedar Street, knelt beside the car, listened, and heard the one thing all 6 experts had missed. What was that strange sound? And why was Caleb Reed the only man on earth who could hear it? The storage facility sat at the edge of Giselle Voss's private property, a climate-controlled vault that held 8 vehicles the way a museum holds irreplaceable art, polished concrete floors, recessed lighting, humidity sensors mounted at every corner, temperature held within a single degree year-round, and at the center of it all, draped in a thin film of dust it had never known before, stood number 47 of 210, a Ferrari Larari Aperta in Rosso Casa, the rarest production variant ever to leave Marinello. 3 weeks ago, it had been alive. Now it simply stood there, silent and immovable, like a creature that had forgotten how to breathe. The car was worth more than most people earned in several lifetimes. And it was completely inexplicably useless. Giselle walked into the room that Thursday morning with her phone already vibrating in her palm, and she did not look at the car right away. She looked out the narrow window at the gray sky above the hills and let the message from Ryan Ashford load on her screen. The 6th garage had withdrawn liability concerns. The message said they were sorry for the inconvenience. She read it twice, put the phone in her pocket, and finally turned to look at the car. It looked back at her the way expensive things do when they have beaten you, quietly without apology. A month before, she had been running the car on a private stretch of straight road, testing nothing in particular. Simply driving because she needed an hour without anyone asking her questions. The car had been performing perfectly. Engine note clean, hybrid. System cycling as designed, and then nothing. No warning light, no shutter. No smoke, no drama. The engine simply stopped communicating with everything attached to it, as though a single thought had been erased from the middle of a sentence. She coasted to a stop and sat in the sudden silence for a long time. The Ferrari's onboard diagnostics returned no fault codes. The AQ log was clean and unblemished. When the first technical team arrived 2 days later from Ferrari's North American service division, their lead technician spent 6 hours connected to the car's data ports and found nothing that explained what had happened. He apologized professionally and left. The second team came from Germany and brought more expensive equipment. They also found nothing. The third team was local but highly credentialed. The fourth team arrived from Europe at Giselle's personal invitation. By the fifth team, she had stopped being surprised and started being methodical. She documented every inspection, filed every report, and said nothing publicly until she was certain. Then she summoned 3 journalists she trusted and delivered the statement that would end up in 4 automotive publications by the following morning. The car represented an unsolvable problem, and she was treating it as such. She called it a curiosity rather than a failure, and she phrased it with the precise confidence of someone who has learned that controlling the narrative is the only form of control that never gets taken away. Ryan Ashford stood beside her during that small briefing with his hands folded at his waist and his expression set to the specific frequency of a man who agrees with everything his boss says. He had been her deputy at Voss Industries for 3 years, a man whose professional reputation was built on loyalty and attention to detail and the particular talent for anticipating what needed to be done before being asked to do it. He was the person she trusted most inside the company's structure. And that morning, he stood behind her right shoulder while she spoke to the journalists and nodded in all the correct places. When a photographer turned toward the car, the right corner of Ryan's mouth moved upward in a way that had nothing to do with the moment. The expression lasted less than a second. It was not pride and it was not amusement. It was the expression of someone whose plan is proceeding on schedule. Giselle did not see it. She was already answering the next question. She drove back to her office through late afternoon traffic and told herself that the sixth garage withdrawing was not a setback but an elimination. One more name crossed off a list that would eventually reach the right name. That was how she had built Voss Industries. From a regional logistics company into a $400 million technology and infrastructure group. That was how she had survived every attempt to diminish her that this industry had produced. Remove the variables, narrow the field, keep moving. She had never encountered a problem that did not eventually resolve under sufficient pressure and intelligence, and she saw no reason to believe this one would be different. What she did not yet understand and would not understand for several more days was that the answer had been sitting on Cedar Street for 4 years, under a sign that had not been repainted since the previous owner, waiting for exactly this problem, the way certain tools wait in drawers for the one job they were built to do. It did not advertise itself. It did not need to. Reed Automotive occupied a 2-bay building on the east end of Cedar Street, between a dry cleaner and a hardware store that had been trying to close for 3 years. The sign above the door was painted directly on the wood. Dark blue, letters on white, no logo, no tagline. The parking lot held 4 spaces and a crooked basketball hoop someone had bolted to a telephone pole years ago and never removed. From the outside, it looked like exactly what it was, a small, unglamorous place where cars were fixed for reasonable prices by people who knew what they were doing. From the inside, it was something else entirely. The floor was sealed epoxy and pale gray, clean enough to eat from. The tool cabinets along the back wall were arranged by function and dimension with a precision that looked almost aggressive. Every surface was organized, the way a surgical room is organized. Nothing placed casually, nothing left where it did not belong. Measurements were verified before they were relied upon. Documentation was kept on every vehicle that came through the base. A car that left Reed Automotive left in better condition than it arrived. And every person who had ever brought a vehicle there knew that what they were paying for was not simply labor, but exactness. The shop had no reviews posted anywhere, no referral program, and a waiting list that moved at its own pace, regardless of how urgently the person calling believed their situation to be. Diana Flores had worked there for 2 years and still found it quietly unsettling on slow mornings when there were no cars to disrupt the geometry of the place. She was sitting at the front desk that Wednesday with a mug of coffee and a stack of invoices when the phone rang, and the voice on the other end asked about a diagnostic inspection for a vehicle described only as a specialty European sports car. Diana asked for the make and model. There was a brief pause, and then the caller said it. Diana wrote it on a notepad with careful handwriting, thanked the caller, confirmed the appointment for Friday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and set the phone down. Then she walked through the door to the service bay and crouched beside the rear wheel arch of the Porsche 911 that was currently elevated on the left side lift. She could see Caleb's forearms below the chassis. She read him the make and model off the notepad in the same neutral tone she used for everything. Caleb Reed did not move for 4 seconds. His hands, which had been positioned at a particular bolt with the ease of someone who had performed this action hundreds of times, stayed exactly where they were. Then he finished the turn, set the wrench down on the drop cloth, and slid out from under the car. He stood without urgency, and looked at the notepad she was holding, then at the calendar on the wall. He told her to confirm the appointment standard. Diagnostic rate, no deposit required. No concessions on timing. Diana studied his face in the way she had learned to over 2 years of working beside him, she went back to the front desk and confirmed what Diana knew about Caleb. Reed's past, she had not learned from him directly. She had assembled it slowly from pieces he had let slip. During long afternoons when the shop was quiet and the work was the kind that allowed for conversation without demanding it, she knew he had spent nearly a decade in automotive engineering before Cedar Street at the highest level of the industry at a facility in northern Italy whose name she recognized immediately when he mentioned it once and never mentioned again. She knew his wife had died 4 years ago and that whatever the circumstances of that loss had been, they were not something he had any intention of explaining to anyone. She knew the move to Cedar Street had been a deliberate choice, not a fall, not a failure, but a withdrawal. The kind of withdrawal that has nothing to do with defeat and everything to do with survival. He did not have regrets about the career he had stepped away from. Or, if he did, he had organized them into something too compact and private to be visible. He had rebuilt himself on Cedar Street into someone who served the work rather than the industry, who was respected by every customer who came through the door and known by none of them beyond the quality of what he delivered. She had the good sense to respect it completely, and in return, Caleb trusted her in the specific and limited way that solitary people trust the few individuals they choose to keep close. He looked at the calendar one more time before going back to the Porsche. The appointment was written in her handwriting. G. Voss, Friday, 200 p.m. The car carrier arrived at 2 minutes before 2. Diana watched it from the front window. A flatbed truck, pulling a low loader with the Ferrari strapped carefully in the center, covered at the hood and rear with soft, fitted cloth. Behind it came a black SUV with tinted windows, and behind that, a second SUV. 3 people stepped out before Giselle Voss stepped out. They fanned out in a way that was not quite security and not quite staff, but something that occupied the uncomfortable space between both. Giselle herself emerged last, adjusting the cuff of her blazer as she took in Reed Automotive with an expression that was not hostile, but was absolutely not impressed. She was 35 with the kind of composure that read as coldness until you looked at her eyes, which were performing a continuous and rapid assessment of everything in her field of vision. Simultaneously, she looked at the building, the sign, the parking lot, the visible equipment through the open bay door. She had stood in front of far more impressive facilities and had not been convinced by any of them. She crossed the lot toward Caleb, who had walked out with a shop cloth in one hand and nothing in the other, and she did not offer her hand. She opened with the facts. 6 inspection teams, no fault identified, escalating costs and 0 results. Ryan Ashford had suggested one additional consultation before she made the final decision about the vehicle's status, and she was here because she respected the principle of exhausting options even when she did not expect results from them. She said all of this in the even practiced cadence of someone who has given many briefings. When she finished, she looked at Caleb and waited for the standard performance of confidence, the reassurance, the upward adjustment in posture that men in his position typically produced when faced with a woman who had more money than them and was not hiding it. Caleb did none of those things. He looked past her at the car for a moment. Then he asked her one question. Under what specific driving conditions had the engine cut out a straight section of road or during a directional change? Giselle stopped. She replayed the question in her mind, not because it was complicated, but because in 3 weeks, in 6 consultations, no one had asked it. She told him, straight road, constant speed, no steering input, no gradient change. He nodded once. He said nothing else. He walked toward the carrier. He circled the car twice without touching it, his hands at his sides, his pace unhurried. Giselle followed at a distance, watching him the way you watch someone perform an action You do not recognize, but sense is purposeful. One of her assistants began to speak and she raised 2 fingers. Without looking at him, he stopped. Caleb reached the right side air intake, behind the passenger door and crouched beside it. He tilted his head toward the intake opening. He stayed in that position for a long time, longer than seemed necessary for any inspection Diana had witnessed, and she was watching from the doorway with her coffee mug in both hands. Then Caleb straightened and turned to Diana and said one word in a language that was not English. Risenza. He said it quietly, the way someone says a word that solves something. Diana knew what it meant. Giselle did not, but she caught the shift in his posture and took 2 steps forward. She asked him what he had just said. Caleb did not answer the question directly. He asked instead whether the vehicle's original factory technical documentation had accompanied the car. Today, not the owner's manual, the original build record documentation. Giselle's assistant glanced at another assistant. No one had thought to bring it. Giselle's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes moved. She told her team to retrieve it from the facility by end of day. Caleb looked at her steadily and said he would need 48 hours, that the vehicle would remain in his bay during that time, and that he preferred to work without her representative present on site. He did not say Ryan Ashford's name. He said, "Your representative." Giselle looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Fine." It was the first time in 3 weeks she had said that word and believed it. The shop was locked to the public by 6 o'clock that evening, but the lights inside stayed on until past midnight. Caleb worked alone except for Diana, who had offered to stay and sat near the tool bench with her laptop doing invoices and not asking questions. The Ferrari sat in the center bay with its right side access panels removed, the car's inner architecture exposed under the shop's overhead lights with the kind of clinical detail that made it look simultaneously more beautiful and more vulnerable than it did, sealed and painted and whole. Caleb moved through the disassembly with a methodical ease that required no consultation, no reference manual, no pause to think. He worked from memory the way surgeons work, with the confidence of someone whose knowledge of the structure is so complete that the structure itself holds no surprises. Diana watched him from the corner of her eye when she thought he was not paying attention. She had seen him work on complex machinery before. She had not seen him work like this. His movements had a quality she had no precise word for. Not speed, not skill exactly, but something closer to fluency, the way a native speaker moves through a language without translating. The hiker's integration module sat at the junction between the combustion engine and the electric drive system, a component that most technicians never touched because most technicians never needed to. Caleb reached it by removing a secondary heat shield and a bracket assembly that was not visible in any publicly available service document. The modules sat in its housing, visually unremarkable, and nested inside its lower channel was the pressure regulation valve, a component roughly the size of a man's thumb, made of a titanium alloy developed specifically for this application. To an untrained eye, it looked perfect. To Caleb Reed, it looked like what it was, the source. He explained it to Diana without her asking, speaking quietly as he worked. The valve was designed to modulate pressure between the hybrid and combustion systems at extremely precise intervals, but under a specific convergence of temperature, road speed, and load. A convergence that happened to occur on a straight flat road at constant velocity on a warm afternoon. The valve was capable of producing a resonance frequency in the low end acoustic range. That frequency caused a micro vibration in its own mounting bracket. That vibration lasting less than 20 milliseconds was sufficient to interrupt the signal pathway between the hiker's module and the engine control unit. The interruption did not register in the AQ log because it fell below the system's minimum threshold for fault recording. The engine experienced it not. as a malfunction but as a command. It shut down cleanly. It left no evidence. Diana looked up from her laptop and asked how anyone was supposed to find that. Caleb said that was exactly the right question. He told her about the recall. Not in general terms, in specific ones. The valve's design characteristic had been identified during post-production quality analysis of the 47th through 52nd units of the 210-unit production run. A small internal working group at the Marinello facility had documented the issue, calculated the probability of failure under real-world driving conditions, and prepared a corrective action report. The report recommended a silent replacement program for the affected units. 6 cars, whose owners would be contacted individually, would bring their vehicles in under the guise of a routine service. Check-in would leave with the corrected part installed and no paperwork that described what had actually been done. It was the kind of protocol that large manufacturers use when a flaw is real enough to correct but narrow enough not to constitute a safety crisis. Caleb had written that report. He had been the senior integration engineer responsible for the higher system on the LaFerrari program, and when the characteristic emerged in post-production data, he had been the one who identified it, documented it and specified the corrective path. The replacement program had been initiated internally, but the owner notification process for units 47 through 52 had been delayed, first by internal review then by reorganization within the service division. The notifications had not gone out before he left the company, and they had apparently not reached Giselle Voss in the years since. He set down the tool he was holding and was quiet for a moment. Then he looked more closely at the valve. In its housing, not at its function, but at its physical orientation. He produced a small beam flashlight and angled it across the surface of the mounting bracket. There was a mark on the adjustment bolt. Not damage, not wear, a rotation mark, the kind left by a tool. Applying deliberate torque, he measured the current angle of the bolt against the specification he carried in memory. 1/8 of a turn out of position. Enough to shift the resonance onset to a lower speed threshold to guarantee the failure would occur under more common driving conditions, to ensure it would manifest within weeks rather than the months it might otherwise have taken. He took photographs. He got a micrometer from the cabinet and took measurements. He wrote the figures on a clean notepad. Double C.